Perfect. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to another exclusive SUP workshop. This one is around growing your marketing and growth teams. And as always, purpose of this workshop is to give you as an entrepreneur, startup founder, quick and tangible advice how to improve your startup journey. 45-minute plus 15-minute Q&A. And as always, for best experience, keep your mics on mute and webcams turned on. And we'll share this afterwards and the deck if someone wants it. And thanks for Bianca to coordinate and to Susannah and her team for making this possible. And yeah, make sure you respond to the survey after this session. I'll trigger it from here. And pleasure to welcome today's experts, Emma, Susannah, and Louisa. Thanks so much for joining us today. And they'll take us through the workshop, and they all have senior experience in this. I'm very happy to have you guys share your perspective today, and also complementary skill sets to each other. So really good that we can have all of you here today. So that being said, leaving the mic to Susannah. Thanks for joining.
Perfect. Thanks, Sebastian. Lovely to be here, team. So just quickly to introduce the relationship. So Sebastian and I have known each other for a while, have spent numerous conversations just talking about the various complexities, challenges of scaling early and growth stage businesses. And one of the topics that we've had some conversation about is the marketing and growth function generally. And so we collectively thought it would be useful to come together and talk through some of the things that we've seen that are both challenges and ways that businesses have overcome those challenges in the space. Just to give a bit of context, so the three of us are from True Search. True is a global executive search firm, 11 years old now, headquartered originally out of Silicon Valley. We are about 900 individuals now and a truly global business, and focus exclusively on tech and tech-enabled businesses. Have done so for the full time that we've been ramping up, and really working within the venture capital and growth space, helping organizations that are tech and tech-enabled to scale at pace and scale successfully. So we spend almost 100% of our time working with very entrepreneurial businesses and individuals going through these complex journeys. I sit within the consumer practice in the London office and focus on go-to-market hires, everything through commercial and marketing leadership. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, Emma and Louisa, who I'll hand over just to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the presentation. Do you want to go first?
Yes, let's do it. Thanks so much, Sus. Hi, everyone. So I'm a partner here in our dedicated consumer practice, based in London, but I work really broadly across Europe. And I've really been developing a specialism in marketing and growth hiring across consumer tech clients, from mobile first subscription apps to e-commerce, marketplaces, fintech. We kind of cover a really broad spectrum. And I've done a lot of work in the Nordics. So maybe some clients that you'd be familiar with are Storytel, Estrid, Order, Musician, and Luna. I'll hand over to Louisa now.
Thanks so much. And I must apologize on behalf of the very loud jazz music that is currently happening in my background. So if anyone can't hear me, give me a shout. But I'm a principal in our London office. And like Emma, I focus on go-to-market, but specifically for B2B businesses. And within that, my specialism and excitement comes at the higher velocity end of B2B. So where we might see the most natural parallels with consumer, hence today's topic of conversation, and where we're seeing more demand for these growth roles within this context. So that's very much kind of where I sit, working with businesses like wetransfer, Clio, Spendesk, again, to call out a Nordic business, Bambusa, we did the CMO for recently. So that's me, and that's kind of where the overlap might come in today's conversation.
Perfect. So why don't we jump into it? So we've got a bit of an agenda here, but we'll jump into it as we've done the introductions. Em and Louisa, do you want to kick us off just talking through the evolution of marketing that we've seen on both B2B and B2C over the last 30 years?
Sorry, Susannah, sorry to jump in. Do you want to full screen the presentation, or
Yeah,
will it mess with your view?
There we go.
Appreciate it.
No problem.
Great. So it goes without saying, marketing is such a complex function that has evolved really rapidly over the last 30 years, as you can see in this slide, and it continues to change at pace. So before the internet, consumer marketing used to be focused mainly on above the line channels. So using mass media such as TV and radio and billboards to appeal to really large audiences. This was super untargeted because you don't know who's viewing the advert, which is really great for kind of brand awareness, but really hard to measure the direct impact on sales and revenue. It was always well suited to FMCG products, as everyone has a need for these products. And it was very much about creating a story and enticing the consumers in. And if we looked at kind of below the line marketing, that was typically direct mail, sponsorships, brochures, PR, about 20, 30 years ago. And the best marketeers would often join FMCG brands like P&G and Unilever, and they'd be referred to as classically trained because they would get the best training in how to build a brand. And they're often described as being customer insights and content driven, using the data that they found on customers to really shape the brand. And that data specifically would mainly be collected using customer focus groups and questionnaires. And their marketing methodology was based on the 5 Ps, which you've probably heard of before. So product, pricing, promotion, place, and people. And they were really commercial and broad in how they thought about building brands. Now, as the emergence of the internet and the creation of all these new digital channels, and also the amount of granular data we have on individual customers, this really allowed marketeers and businesses to be much more targeted on who and how they approach, and also more importantly, how they engage and retain those consumers. So marketing has evolved from being a one-sided conversation with the customer to being all about relationship building. And now businesses prioritize actually engagement, retention, loyalty, and personalized content. So whilst classically trained brand marketeers tend to be customer insights and content driven, focusing on long-term brand building, performance and growth marketeers are digitally channel driven with really strong analytical and data expertise, typically with a test and measure mentality and a focus on results and metrics. They will often have a bias towards growing revenue, user growth, and conversion, as opposed to kind of communicating company values and purpose. And as there are now way more channels available, the role of the CMO is to really figure out, what channels to spend their budget on and how to make all those channels work in harmony. Now, if we bring this back to kind of talent and what we're seeing in the talent market, 5 years ago, we were often asked to hire performance marketing focused CMOs in consumer tech businesses, often at the earlier stages. But really the demand has shifted as the businesses have scaled to bring on board more brand-led CMOs, really to help them, have that holistic view on all of their marketing channels. And you'll see this in companies like Delivery Hero or HelloFresh, where, the marketeers that they hired 10 years ago are very different to the marketeers that they're hiring today.
It's so funny hearing you talk about it, Emma, because I think one of the conversations we're going to have today, and one of the ways that we think about hiring more imaginatively from a B2B perspective, is looking at B2B in the context of consumer. And what we so often see in hiring trends is that B2B follows consumer. And I think that's more true of marketing than anywhere else. And if you think about the way that sales motions within B2B more broadly have evolved, you've seen a real devolution of power. So software has gone from being an extremely expensive commodity that the highest executives would make the decisions on, to SaaS, where subscription was far more affordable, and suddenly your software products became verticalized, and then it was the heads of department who were buying them, to what we're seeing now, which we refer to as the consumerization of the enterprise, but can really be summarized as product-led growth or usage-based pricing, where suddenly you've got this index upon the individual within each business becoming your power user. So although it might be a very, very large enterprise business, and we can look at companies like Box and Atlassian who do this extremely well, although they might be these large businesses, they're operating on a very individualized basis. And it's about the end user and about how they interact with the product that dictates how well your product performs. And that kind of switch has really changed the way that B2B marketers are thinking about interacting with their audiences. And that's where we're starting to see this. How can we access different channels? How can we meet those individuals where they're utilizing these products, rather than that very top, high level, more account-based marketing strategy that we might have seen 10, 15 years ago? There is still a place for those strategies, but the more interesting piece right now within B2B is where the more kind of consumerized side of those strategies comes to play. And that's what we'll be exploring a little bit more of today.
Great. So let's talk through a little bit around, what you see as a sort of traditional marketing profile versus what you're seeing as that growth profile. And if you guys can talk about what you see from the consumer perspective and the B2B perspective as well, that'll be really useful for the group.
Yeah, thanks, Suze. Well, let's start with B2C. So growth, I'm sure you've heard the term growth quite a lot. It can be quite a confusing term because it's used to describe many different remits and skill sets. And it's a term that got coined in the US maybe 3-4 years ago and has made its way over to Europe in the last few years, with demand for VP growths and CGOs rising. You'll often see that whatever happens in the US, it will take like 2 or 3 years to come to Europe, and then we'll see kind of a rise in it. So if we talk about growth when in the context of marketing, growth teams essentially help increase the rate of customer acquisition, retention, and revenue by optimizing products and inventing, in some cases, new marketing channels. And so the main difference between marketing and growth is that marketing often focuses on the upper funnel, as you can see in the slide, of awareness and acquisition, whereas growth refers to the whole marketing funnel, all the way from awareness through to referral, and it takes a holistic and kind of cross-functional approach to this. So growth leaders in a B2C context often spike heavily on performance marketing and the analytical side of marketing. Even some of them, some VP growths that I've placed recently have started off in engineering and product development and then moved over to marketing. And often they'll have cross-functional teams. So they'll have all of the performance marketing channels, CRM, data analysts. Sometimes they'll have dotted lines to product managers and engineers. And then they work really hand in glove with the product team, the brand team, the engineering teams. So it's definitely a kind of cross-functional way of working, and a really collaborative way of working to really enhance growth, essentially. However, the growth function really only works if an organization has the right culture and also the right structure to accommodate it. So businesses really need to be highly collaborative, innovative, and agile in nature to make this work. We'll talk about this later on in the presentation when we discuss the Spotify model. So yeah, over to you, Lou. It'd be great to understand what you're seeing in B2B.
Yeah, it's very similar, frankly, within a B2B context. The one thing I would say is that if this is a relatively new role in consumer, it's really, really new in B2B. I think probably the nexus of marketing roles that we've seen, and we kind of, for the sake of argument, categorize growth under marketing for now, although there are various arguments around that in itself. If we do, in terms of the focus of marketing roles, we're still not seeing a huge demand for them yet, but that's only going to evolve and change. And if you look at the most successful B2B models over the last 10, 15 years, they're already using this kind of growth concept, cross-functional collaboration concept at the highest levels. So if you look at Figma, for example, Amanda Clayer, who's the chief customer officer there, she's actually responsible for the full funnel. So she has revenue, marketing, customer success, and parts of product under her remit, because what they've tried to do is establish, as Em's talked about in the consumer context, much more of an agile, collaborative view of the entire customer journey, rather than breaking it up into silos and creating and extending that journey. The idea is frictionless and quick, and it makes for a much more UX friendly product, and that makes for a much more successful product. So that's kind of the impetus behind that. If we go on to the next slide, Suze, I think we just kind of touched on where this is kind of being introduced and we're seeing it. And we touched on some of this. What is quite interesting from a hiring perspective is when you start thinking about the introduction of the growth function and what the kind of precipitation might be for growth, why you might want to introduce growth. So we actually on the next slide have a couple of questions that we tend to talk through with founders when it comes to when would you introduce this function and why. Some of the key things you might want to think about are what makes a good growth leader and what makes that person the right person for you now. What is your motion and what are your current levers for growth? If you can answer all of those questions, it's going to get you a lot closer to the type of person that you want to bring in. Because, and as Emma's mentioned, growth comes in many different formats, particularly within a B2B context. So what you want to try to do is narrow it down as much as possible, as early as possible, and it's going to narrow your kind of field of potential targets. Guys, do we want to touch quickly on a real life case study?
Yeah, let's do it.
Wonderful. So we were actually brought in to hire a VP growth for a business called Craft recently. And Craft is interesting because they are ostensibly a B2B productivity tool, but very, very high velocity. And in fact, they gained 1 million users in 3 years with zero spend on marketing or sales. And the trick was kind of the most pure version of product-led growth that you can think about. The product was just so viral that they had no need of any kind of spend. However, what they started to find is that they were creating this kind of nexus of power users within large enterprise businesses. I think at one point, they had something like 50% of the FTSE 100 using the tool, but in individual sporadic cases. What they were finding is that we were getting a lot of inbound from those companies saying, we want an enterprise version of this that we can use on a larger team scale, and we want to pay for it, which is kind of the dream. So what they decided to do was bring in a VP growth, but it was a very specific role because it had to be somebody who understood how to introduce friction to a frictionless motion without losing any of their engagement. So they needed to understand pricing, packaging, positioning, all pieces that a traditional marketing leader within B2B hasn't owned before. So if we go on to the next slide, the person that we ended up bringing in actually had a really unique background because she had been both a CRO and a CMO, and she had worked in B2B, B2C, and B2B B2C. All of this to say that when you're thinking about bringing in a growth leader at this point within a B2B context, you need to be creative with it. There is not a one size fits all or a cut and paste version of this leadership currently within Europe. It's much more about how do we find the different levers that are working for you now? How do we find those in parallel markets and parallel profiles? And how do we bring all of those together to create the kind of leader that you need? The thing that Em touched on is probably the most pivotal piece, culture. They have to have the right approach to working collaboratively and cross-functionally with the different pieces. And the one thing that Vanessa has always done very articulately, and one of the things we were looking for when we were interviewing her, was how was she talking about product feedback loops? How was she talking about her interaction with the engineering team? How did she think about sales? How was she thinking about avoiding sales cannibalizing that beautiful product-led growth motion? And all of those different pieces were just part and parcel of her DNA. So it's difficult to filter for, but it's how we have started to think about growth as a function outside of kind of the traditional marketing role.
Fantastic. That's a really useful example of how to be creative and imaginative in thinking about solving for these sorts of problems. Should we jump through to the next case study?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting about this is something that we'll loop back to very, very quickly, actually, around product-led growth. So we've obviously touched on it throughout. WeTransfer and the hire of the CMO there was probably one of the first pure product-led growth CMO roles we were brought in to do from a B2B perspective. WeTransfer were about 100 million in revenue when they decided to bring in their CMO, but they were only Series B. But from a data perspective, they were operating pretty much like a Series A in the sense that they had no marketing tech, no stack at all. They had no way of bringing in their data, because up to that point, the freemium motion that they had was entirely anonymous. You didn't even need an email address in order to utilize the tool. And the only way that the business was bringing in money was through the advertising side of the business. And if you've ever seen wetransfer, you'll have seen the integrated advertising that's part of their kind of homepage. What they wanted to do was make sure that the actual transfer tool was generating revenue for them, but they couldn't do that without bringing in a marketer who really understood how to utilize their anonymous data in a way that made sense for the business moving forward. That skill set at the time in Europe, if it's nascent now, it was light years away. Really, this person didn't operate or exist in Europe. So actually, the person we ended up hiring was from New York and actually didn't come from a B2B background at all. So Ange worked at WeWork at the time, which I appreciate is a B2B business, but her side of the business was actually the consumer side. So during the pandemic, Ange was the person who led the campaign for WeWork Consumer. She started the 2 subscription models that people started using so prolifically during the pandemic, and she scaled them to 150 million revenue in a year and a half. So we knew she could do it. She also had a data science background. And what was crucial about that hire and the way that we were thinking about that was, again, with the craft hire, where are your parallel levers of growth? Where can you find them in similar industries? And where can you then pull that skill set across to make sense for a high velocity motion? Because it's not straightforward within this context. And there needs to be an agility to the way that you're thinking through the market. One thing that we will touch on later as well as the data piece on this, it's fascinating. Em's going to talk a little bit about it, but should we just chat through kind of product-led growth and what we're seeing from that side?
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's do it. So product-led growth it's not a new term, although it is a new function, and roles have been newly created to focus on driving product-led growth, which is new across the B2C space. So product-led growth, as Louisa mentioned, can be defined as a business strategy that relies on using your product as the main vehicle to acquire, activate, and retain customers. It's often cheaper, reaches more people, and has proven results for B2C, SaaS, and B2B businesses. So unlike sales-led companies where the whole goal is to take a buyer from point A to B in a sales cycle, product-led companies really flip that traditional sales model on its head. And product-led companies make this possible by giving you a way to experience the product for free, either through a freemium product or through a kind of free trial. And if the customer experiences a meaningful outcome while using the product, upgrading to a paid plan is kind of a no-brainer for them. And when we talk about kind of B2C, we often see this a lot in consumer subscription businesses where the product is a digital product and retention is absolutely key to their growth. So maybe a bit of a case study from my side. So we recently placed the VP of product-led growth for a consumer app called Prisma. So essentially they're a photo and video editing app. They leverage AI, it's mainly used by kind of creatives in the industry. And we hired this product-led growth, and they actually reported directly into the founder and the chief product officer. And essentially this person sits in the product team, but works really closely with the marketing team, essentially acting as that glue between marketing, product, and engineering. And whilst the marketing team is responsible for everything kind of that goes on to acquire the consumer, what this person focused on is everything that happens post-install. So that includes onboarding, activation, CRM, and retention. So they're constantly looking at the data and identifying patterns in user behavior. So for example, if the onboarding process isn't seamless and you see users dropping off at that stage, they would then suggest to the product team that actually we need to improve this feature. We need to make it simpler and quicker. And so they really focus on designing, launching, and operating a kind of continuous process of experimentation. And they also implement all of those successful experiments really to drive constant incremental improvements to average revenue per user and also LTV. And they also get really involved in kind of new monetization models. So monetization and pricing can often be part of the role of a product-led growth leader. And if we look at talent and where you find these people, again, it's a nascent function, especially here in Europe. So product-led growth leaders can come from product and engineering, But they can also come from marketing, those that have kind of maybe moved over to product that are more on the analytical side. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a sense of what it means in a consumer function. But let's see, Lou, is that the same for B2B?
So it's interesting because you would have thought naturally that a product-led growth role would be the most kind of logical step for an organization in a B2B context, but we're actually not seeing any of those specific roles as they're kind of termed. The function that we're seeing that's probably taking care of most of that post-sales piece is customer success. And probably from 2020 to 2023, we saw a 200% increase in demand for those roles. I think the revenue operations function also plays a part in that, just kind of creating, again, that holistic feedback loop, that flywheel that you want to engender throughout the entire cycle. That's where we're seeing most of that impact. What we found very interesting as well when we were kind of researching product-led growth and how we think about it is the acquisition models are very, very similar, as you can see, for B2C and B2B. The only difference from a marketing perspective, I think, is the impact on product qualified leads as opposed to traditional marketing qualified leads. You're suddenly seeing much more demand for actually, how is the product being received? And it's one step closer to your end user, and it's creating a much tighter feedback loop. And that means that ultimately the end sale is much more successful because you have much more specific data that's much more in line with what your actual consumers are saying at that point, at the point of purchase, rather than what can happen with marketing is that you can have a slightly delayed response. And so that's a really interesting evolution to see. But yeah, I would say within a B2B context, the product-led growth role specifically, not so much. The impact on the other roles is what we're still working on and exploring.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about the complexity of different regulation changes that we've seen over the last couple of years. I think this has popped up hugely, certainly on the consumer side, and people are having to think very differently about how they're utilizing data to market to their end customers. I'm sure that's been the same on the B2B side as well, Louisa, but do you both want to sort of talk us through what you've seen on this and how some of the businesses that you guys are working with are looking at solving for these challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. So as you know, there have been a number of significant changes in regulation affecting the advertising industry. I think it's over the last 5 years with GDPR, CCPA, and iOS 14. So in today's connected world, personal data is being collected at an incredible rate, and the websites you use, the calls you make, the places you visit are all measured, and they leave a digital footprint. And this footprint is fast becoming a prized resource. And because personal data is so valuable, it's also really vulnerable to theft and misuse. And this has led to consumers demanding to know how companies use and store their personal data. And essentially, consumers are not convinced that companies are doing enough to protect them. So this resulted in the creation of GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation. And it's the digital privacy regulation that was introduced in May 2018 in Europe. And it standardizes a wide range of different privacy legislations across the EU into one central set of regulations that will protect users in all member states. So companies are now required to build in privacy settings into their digital products and websites and have them switched on by default. We also have the CCPA, which is essentially the California Consumer Privacy Act, again, came into play in 2018. That's essentially the US version of GDPR, to keep it really simple. I would say the most impactful change has not really come through the government. It's actually come through Apple in the form of iOS 14. So Apple has been on a mission to protect the privacy of their users, and they're trying to force a standard on the advertising community, which they believe is beneficial for all of their users. So in June 2020, Apple introduced a new version of its iOS operating system, and it was one of their biggest updates to date. And it introduced lots of different features like home screen design changes and major new features. And one of those or a couple of those features was called App Tracking Transparency, ATT. And ATT allows users to easily block apps from receiving a unique identifier for advertisers. So it's really embedded in their iPhone devices. So this fully eliminates user activity tracking across the apps. And as a result, the next time an iPhone user looks or interacts with an ad, any activity tracking in place would be lost. not to mention the lower match rates and dip in performance for like lookalike audiences, and overall less information on audience performance across campaigns. So the impact for marketeers and companies, it really reduced the visibility for all advertisers into key metrics, which it comes to digital marketing, including kind of paid social and paid search advertising. And then on top of that, in September 2021, iOS 15 was launched, and even more privacy features came into play. So this time it was email campaigns took the biggest hit. The mail privacy protection inhibits senders from learning whether an email has been opened, and it also hides IP addresses, so senders can't learn a user's location or remember their browsing activities. So what does this mean for marketeers? I mean, look, for marketeers, as we know, as we discussed, for B2C and B2B, data is king. And the more information you have available to input into your campaigns, the better results you can see. So with reduced data, it's really harder to reach a specified and large group of people. So if you can't access the demographics and the behavior data, then how do you know if somebody fits into a certain group or not? So digital marketeers and CMOs now must re-examine every strategy and tactic that has worked for years, and also pivot. And we've seen a pivot to a move away from the reliance on performance marketing and paid marketing, and marketers taking a much broader, more holistic approach to really kind of balance out where they deploy their budgets across all different channels from kind of owned, earned, and paid media. And that's obviously having an effect on the types of marketers that they're now hiring into those businesses.
Yeah, anecdotally, it was a question actually with wetransfer. It's one of the things that we sort of touched on earlier with the CMO hire. At the same time that wetransfer were looking to bring in a CMO, they actually achieved their B Corp status. And as part of having B Corp status, there's much more intense scrutiny upon your data and how you utilize it, particularly third-party data. So not only did you have these kind of regulations come in, but also just in terms of the business and their responsibility and their brand, it was something that was top of mind for bringing in the CMO. So that was part of the reason why they wanted to make the switch from an anonymous free-to-use tool where they had to rely on third-party data in order to actually grow, to a paid-for tool where that was first-party data that was being volunteered by users that they could then utilize in order to grow and create predictable growth. So it's a really interesting one in terms of where we've had to think about who we bring into a marketing role, because we really needed somebody who understood and got that in order to actually see that growth within the business.
Perfect, thanks, team. You touched on this before. Let's talk about how Spotify set itself up. Obviously, we know the business collectively as a group here. True's done a lot of work for the benefit of those that don't know. True's done a lot of work with Spotify over the years, so have a good understanding of the evolution of their organizational sort of matrix from a marketing perspective, and how they tackle some of the challenges that Emma and Louisa have been talking through thus far. Do you want to talk us through this a little bit? Yeah.
Definitely. Thanks so much. And just to add, so we've been working with Spotify for over 7 years. I think we've placed over 56 roles, 53% of those actually gender diverse hires, and the majority of those in their product, tech, and data functions. We actually hired their chief content officer, Dawn Ostroff, who actually kind of was brought in to turn them from a music streaming company to an audio platform, which is successfully done. So look, I think the reason why we wanted to bring up Spotify is because they really, were innovators when it comes to, how you structure an organization to operate in a very agile and collaborative way, which is what we've been saying the whole way through this presentation, that it's important that your business does this if you really want to hire, growth leaders and true kind of marketeers that can operate cross-functionally. So, Spotify essentially created the Spotify model, and it represents Spotify's view on scaling from both a technical and a cultural perspective. So the Spotify model was first introduced in 2012 by the founders of Spotify, and they published a white paper called Scaling Agile at Spotify, which was then introduced to create a radically simple way to kind of explain how Spotify approached agility. So part of its appeal is that it focuses on organizing around work rather than following a specific set of practices. So in a traditional scaling framework, specific practices like daily stand-ups, for example, are how the framework is executed, whereas the Spotify model focuses on how businesses can structure an organization to enable agility. So the Spotify model champions team autonomy so that each team, or squad as they refer to it, selects their own framework, whether that be Scrum or Kanban. And squads are then organized into tribes and guilds to help people align and to cross-pollinate knowledge. So the model is all centered around simplicity. And when Spotify began organizing around their work, they identified a handful of important elements on how people and teams should be structured. So just to kind of go through quickly what these means, what the different teams are to help you understand how it's structured. So you have squads. Similar to a Scrum team, squads are cross-functional autonomous teams, typically 6 to 12 people in a squad that focus on one feature area. So each squad has a unique mission that guides the work they do, and an agile coach for support, and then a product owner for guidance. And the squads determine which agile methodology and framework will be used. So they work really autonomously. They're given a lot of trust. Then you have tribes. So when multiple squads coordinate within each other on the same feature area, they form a tribe. And tribes help build alignment across squads and typically consist of about 40 to up to 150 people in order to maintain alignment. And then each tribe has a tribe lead who is then responsible for helping coordinate squads and encouraging collaboration. Then you have chapters. So even though squads are autonomous, it's important that the specialists within those squads, like JavaScript developers, for example, can align on best practice. So chapters are the family that each specialist has, helping to keep engineering standards in place really across a discipline. And chapters are typically led by a senior technology lead who may also be a manager of another team in the chapter. Then you have guilds. So guilds are team members who are passionate about a topic. Anybody passionate about any topic can form a guild, which is essentially a community of interest. So anyone can join a guild, they're completely voluntary, whereas chapters belong to a tribe, kind of guilds can cross different tribes, and there's no formal leader. You just kind of put your hand up and then, coordinate the guild. Then you'll have trios. So a trio is a combination of tribe lead, product lead, design lead, and each tribe has a trio in place to ensure that there's a continuous alignment between 3 perspectives when working on any feature area. Nearly finished. Then there's alliance. Last but not least, an alliance is, as the organization scales, sometimes multiple tribes need to work closely together to accomplish a goal. And so alliances are a combination of tribe trios, typically 3 or more, that work together to help their tribes collaborate on a goal that is bigger than any one tribe. So I think if we look at, it's quite complicated, but I think if you look at the benefits of the model, it's focused on organizing around work and not around process. And this gives an organization greater flexibility when it comes to how squads work. So instead of requiring squads to change how they do work, it focuses on aligning them with each other and driving towards individual team outcomes. The model also encourages autonomy and creativity by trusting people to complete the work they are doing in the way that they see fit. And the Spotify model can also offer increased transparency across the work being done and grow a more experimentation-based model to problem solve in a high-trust environment. So they fail fast. It's a safe environment. You can fail lots of times in Spotify, and that's okay because they're experimenting and you just kind of go, you move on really quickly. And all of this can lead to things like better products, happier customers, and more engaged employees. But it must be said, this model doesn't work for everybody. And some of the challenges with the model, many organizations want to replicate what Spotify have done. But really, it's all around the culture that you have and the structure of your organization and how these teams work together. It might seem like a matrix organizational structure where if you look at it, but it's much more complex than that. And although it might look like a matrix organization, I guess the key cultural elements of the model need to be in place to allow the structure to thrive, such as trust and autonomy. And if an organization doesn't shift their behaviors, then the benefits of the Spotify model will never be realized. So I think if you could take any learnings from the Spotify model, I think if you're looking to enable a culture of trust and autonomy and rapid learning, you can't go wrong with taking inspiration from the Spotify model, but do not copy the model, because I think it's better to seek an understanding of the structure, the practices, and the mindset behind Spotify's approach, and then tweak the model based on your own environment, because this model, the Spotify model, it constantly evolves, and it's been evolving since Spotify was founded. Essentially, the model looks very different to what it was before, so it's constantly moving and shifting depending on the needs of the organization. So hopefully that has been helpful. I know a lot of information there.
That just highlights the need.
Sorry for jumping in. We have a couple of more minutes before the Q&A part starts.
Yeah, no problem. I think we're almost at the end. But that highlights, I think, two of Emma and Louisa's key points through the presentation around culture and really understanding who you are and where you're going from a cultural perspective, and having that agility and understanding to bring these learnings together in a way that makes sense for your business. I think, yes, this is the last slide, Sebastian. So I think we're where we need to be. Lou, do you want to talk us through this slide?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a summary of what we've touched on. Really, there is a rising need within both consumer and B2B. But if I put the B2B lens on it, there's a rising need for more agility when we come to think of how we're looking at marketing and growth functions. And the trick with it is, don't think of it as operational or B2B or operations within silos. Think of where your organization is today, where you need to get to, and what is going to get you there fastest. What is working for you from a growth perspective today and what isn't. Understand your channels intimately, understand what does work, and understand where you can find those similar parallels within other industries. Be agile about it and be creative about it. And look for agility and creativity in the people that you hire, because they're the people that will serve you the best as you continue to grow. Perfect. And that brings us to the last slide. So thank you so much for your engagement through the presentation. We'll move on to the Q&A part of the session. And here you have our names and email addresses in case there are any specific questions that you want to follow up on after the session.
Awesome. Thanks. And also we'll be adding, unless we don't have a service provider perks offers in the platform yet, right?
Not yet. We'll do that. We'll do that this week, Sebastian.
Awesome. So that will be enabled and available either before summer or directly after beginning of mid-July.
Yeah, perfect. So I'll put the question, or we'll put the floor, we'll open the floor to questions, work out how to say that. There's been a lot of content through the session, but any specific points that you'd like us to sort of elaborate on, either Em and Louisa can sort of open up from there. So I'll put to you guys any questions that you have.
Hey guys.
Go ahead.
I have one question. Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yep. So first of all, amazing presentation. I think it falls perfectly in line with some of the things we're developing and building. So especially around the product-led growth. So that was really useful and very inspiring. And obviously some of the companies you mentioned, HubSpot and some of the other ones are driving, that strategy and doing it extremely well. And I would say I've been doing it for the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years. So obviously that's what I'm in the B2B space. So this is perhaps more to you, Louisa. But what kind of mega trends do you see moving forward, from in the B2B SaaS space? AI is affecting so many companies nowadays. So that's going to have a huge impact. But what other mega trends will be shaping the whole B2B growth marketing moving forward? Not only the product led.
Yeah, so I think there are two ways of looking at trends within B2B and probably more broadly. But if we look at it in terms of, oh, is my microphone still working? Because my Zoom has okay, perfect. My Zoom has a habit of cutting out. If we look at it from a motion perspective, and we think of product-led growth as one of many sales motions that you can utilize within a B2B context, and then we look at it as broader trends like AI, for example. I think on a motion side, usage-based pricing is going to become more and more prolific. I think that it ties into the greater democratization of software, right? And the availability of software. So I think the usage-based pricing will become more prominent, and we're just going to move away from SaaS as a concept entirely, to be honest with you. And I think that from a kind of larger trend perspective, absolutely AI, but I think also that much more horizontal rather than vertical products are going to become more and more true. And I think the AI is probably going to assist with that, because it's going to allow for greater flexibility and dexterity between different industries. But again, we're just seeing that in terms of what we're anticipating from a hiring perspective. I'm sure you guys would have different perspectives again.
Any points on that from a consumer perspective?
No, I mean, look, everyone's talking about AI, and I think in certain consumer businesses, it will become prominent. But I think, I think more on the B2B side at this stage, and also we'll see more kind of product-led growth in those kind of consumer tech organizations that have digital products as well. If that makes sense.
Great. Any other questions from the floor?
Yeah, I have a question. Also agree with Dan about the presentation. Really nice. Thank you very much for that. Great insights on the vertical kind of perspective of how to organize and how to put on the growth role. I'm just a bit curious about like size of company when this becomes relevant, because I mean, if you are a small team like ours, we're like six people, we tend to have this kind of joint movement in terms of getting the product and the product market fit and everything in place, and also checking the user experience and getting everything in line. It's pretty much everything we do, so it's kind of pretty much what we do, if you understand what I mean. So so when does it become relevant? Would you say like employer size?
I mean, I think both and Louisa, you can probably give your views on that, because we work with lots of different size businesses. So what different things have you seen with smaller and earlier stage businesses versus the businesses that are sort of larger and in that growth mode? Lou, if I put it to you first, and then you can come back.
I think it's the $1 million question, possibly quite literally. I don't think there's a specific trigger as to when you would start to think about your growth function. It's much more about what you're measuring and what you're looking to grow. So if we kind of take a step back and you think about the way that your company currently operates, if it's working and you are continuing to grow, I don't think you need to preempt the hiring a growth function too early. In my view, and in the view of the businesses that we tend to see, and again, there's no specific size or scale for this, but I think that the point at which your cycle and your motion becomes big enough that you've got multiple functions you need to then draw back together, that's the point at which a growth function can be the most beneficial to your business. And I think until then, a marketing function can kind of incorporate all of that, and it doesn't necessarily need to be delineated out. I would say, if we take it back to the presentation for one moment, just around craft and the example we gave there, from a revenue perspective, craft were pretty early actually. But in terms of a subscriber basis and a user basis, they were huge. And that was the trigger for them. So it wasn't necessarily that they were a 25 million ARR business that had 300 people. It was more about the fact that they had a huge influx of users they didn't know how to harness. So there's unfortunately a no one size fits all response to that question, but I think it is about really understanding what's working for you, what isn't, and how you could solve for that specific example. And is that would you say that's the same for your experiences?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think a lot of the, if we just talk about, you know, consumer apps and consumer subscription apps that are, you know, subscription based, we've worked with a number of them recently, and they think about their VP of growth, or we hire their first VP of growth typically after Series A. So one of the businesses, I think they raised about $5 million in a Series A, so fairly small. They're about 40 people, and they've been relying on really outsourcing a lot of their marketing team and that support there. And they really wanted to insource it and bring on a VP of growth that could essentially build the acquisition and the retention function. So they needed someone that would be super hands-on, because there wasn't really there's about 2 people in the team, but also someone that could be strategic and actually build the plan for them. And I think they had over 1 million users at that point. So that was when it made sense for them to do that. But oftentimes at the really early stages, you can kind of get by using consultants or, you know, outsourcing it using agencies until you get to a point where you can actually you know, bring in somebody to build the team and then invest in the different channels, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really good point that you made, Em, as well. Often it's the trickiest hire to make when you're looking at that individual that can be very hands-on and understands what it's like to be in that early stage of an organization, but has the capability of driving that strategic growth. So has that understanding, because you know, they are the expert in the room once you've brought them into the business to understand, you know, what are the levers that need to be pulled. And to Louisa's point, can see what's working and what's not working, and then can help architect what that growth strategy needs to look like. The utilization of consultants or part-time individuals from a marketing perspective is something that we see relatively often. It's the same with the finance function, because you might need that expertise to be able to identify what's working and what isn't working, but you wouldn't need somebody, you wouldn't want to pay for, and you wouldn't necessarily need somebody that's there full time. But having that visibility is so valuable for when you start to push that button. And the way that we tend to work with earlier stage businesses is very much a test and assess and readjust in terms of the process, through understanding exactly what archetype individual is going to work most effectively for that particular business. It's sometimes, you know, a process of you know, trying something out, having a couple of conversations, and then readjusting, because you don't necessarily know exactly what is working and what's not working and what levers to pull until you start speaking to those experts, until those experts kind of get under the hood of the business. So your consultants can help you to a certain extent, but going through those initial parts of from our perspective of a search, when we're looking at talent, is very valuable for clients at that early stage, because they can reevaluate their thinking on that as well. But it is a very tricky point at which to shift the business into the next mode, and it just takes time to evaluate what the market's saying for your particular business. Cool. Any other questions from the floor before we wrap up?
I can, Johan, Dan, feel free to interrupt me if you have other questions. Quick one. I just reacted, Louisa, to your trend spotting regarding SaaS business model going out of fashion, and instead a usage model going in. Like, isn't the SaaS business model like the most beautiful business model? And now you're saying it's going to go away. Like, can you just like comment on that for 1 second?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone thinks their business model at the time is the best, and hindsight is always 2020. It's just something we've heard more and more about, much more in the US than over here. But just the idea that companies don't want to pay for software they're not always using. They want to pay for the amount that they use. And it's just much more of this, as with all motions, I don't think that will offer, you know, there are some software that don't operate, they operate purely on-prem, and they will always be on-premise, and they will never convert to SaaS. And that works beautifully for that part of the industry. Much the same way, there are some markets and some industries that will never suit moving away from SaaS and being usage-based. But if you are a company that is trying to be as economical and efficient as possible, and you want to subscribe to a piece of software, but you know that actually you only utilize it, say 30% of the year, for example, when your tax review comes around. You need it consistently because you need the software to be tracking your accounting consistently, but you're not necessarily actually using it day to day. And so a usage-based pricing model works really well there because it's much more economical and cost effective. So it's not to say that it will be the perfect solution or that every industry needs to move to it, but I think it's a very interesting evolution of just listening to what people actually want more and making software work for people rather than making people suit the software. And that's the overall trend I think we're seeing more of an emergence of.
Interesting. In both B2B and B2C.
I can only speak for B2B, but what's your view?
I think it's mostly on B2B. I haven't seen this as a trend in B2C, not on the, I think it would be more present on the subscription businesses, but it's not something that I've heard of recently. And as I said, if this is happening in the US now, then it probably won't come to Europe for the next kind of 2-3 years, and it probably certainly won't hit consumer for a little bit as well.
But I mean, it's essentially maybe this is a very basic way of putting it, but it's essentially what consumer already does. If you use Deliveroo, unless you're signing up to Deliveroo Premium, which you're probably not because it's not really worth it, you're using Deliveroo on a usage-based pricing model. And so we're just mimic B2B, yeah, exactly. It's basically on demand, and B2B is just mimicking B2C. It's always the way. You guys do it better. And then we try and do it even better. It doesn't work.
I love that.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Cool. Sebastian, shall I hand over to you to wrap up?
Yes. Thanks so much, Susannah, Emma, Louisa. Really insightful. And again, if you want to ask any, do you have a final 20-second question, or you're unmuted?
No, I'm just in a quiet room, so.
Got it. Okay, cool. And again, like, you can reach out to them. Maybe you can scroll to the slide with the email addresses while I wrap up.
Oh, yeah.
And it's truesearch.com as well, so you can, if you want to read more about the company. Again, thank you so much for coordinating and joining us, and Johan and Dan. And stay tuned for more invites to workshops and investor ficas. We're going to start again in August with those. But stay tuned. We're going to do a lot of updates on the platform as well. Thanks again for tuning in, and everyone for being here, and have a great afternoon and evening.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Nice
everyone.
presentation.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.